A warm welcome to the 12th Dr. Mani Kamerkar Endowment Lecture, which will be delivered by Dr. Zareer Masani on the topic Rediscovering India, India's Past, what British Orientalists did to explore and conserve our classical heritage. May I please invite Dr. Zareer Masani and the chairperson, Dr. David, to take their place at the podium. Now, before we launch into this subject, I would like to give you a short introduction on Dr. Mani Kamerkar, in whose name this endowment lecture has been created. I'll try and be brief. There's a lot one can say about each one of the three people here. Not Dr. Kamerkar, of course. But so, Dr. Mrs. Mani Kamerkar was born on the 14th of October 1925 in a well-established Parsi family, and she spent the first 12 years of her life in Kobe, Japan in the early 1930s. After returning to India, she finished her education in St. Mary's School, Pune, then joined college in Bombay, graduating in history and politics from Elphinstone College. When she joined college in 1942, the freedom movement was in full swing. Women were often in the limelight. Mani got involved with political groups in the college and on many occasions attended public meetings of Gandhiji, Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel and others, and soon became an ardent nationalist. She joined the Socialist Party and worked in the trade union movement, where she met her husband, Padmakar Kamerkar, who was very active in the freedom struggle. And he later obtained an LLB degree and became a highly respected lawyer, particularly known for his expertise in constitutional and industrial law. Mani continued with her teaching work as University Professor of History, Modern South Asia, concentrating in particular on social history, especially dealing with Parsis. She later became the founder principal of the Maniben Nanavati Women's College from 1972 to 1985, and Director, College Development Council of the SNDT University from 1986 to 1990. She took up serious historical research and writing on Western India and has several publications in books and reputed journals to her credit. She was well known in history circles as an authority on the colonial period. Mani joined the Asiatic Society of Bombay in 1961 and rose to be one of the 4 vice presidents in 1993. She had completed her PhD in 1976 and was recognized as a PhD guide. Since 1981, she has been a trustee of Avehi, an audiovisual resource center disseminating material to schools and adult education centers. She was president of the Women Graduates Union, Bombay chapter of the Indian Federation of University Women, affiliated to the International Federation of University Women. She was member, Association for Asian Studies, USA, fellow, International Center for Asian Studies, Hong Kong, fellow and member, Institute of Historical Studies, Calcutta, president of the annual conference of the national body held in 1992, and chairperson, India History and Culture Society, an All India organization in 1990. For those who knew Mani personally, she was kind and affectionate and was admired and loved by one and all, including her family, and many of them are here today. I forgot to mention this earlier. Her daughter, I think her grandson will soon be here, and other members from her family. She was also loved by her colleagues at work and especially her students, some of whom later became loyal friends like Dr. Kunjulata Shah, who's sitting here with us, and of course Dr. Usha Thakkar as well, who are all associated very closely with Dr. Mani Kamerkar. On a personal note, because she is my mommy, I have to say that she led a life of extreme simplicity, devoid of any luxury or artifice. She and her husband shared a life embedded in a deep sense of ethical principles and values that remained steadfast till the end. They worked tirelessly for the multiple causes they believed in with altruism and benevolence. Dr. Mani Kamerkar passed away in Mumbai on 11th October 2004 at the age of 79 years. In her will, she left a generous endowment of 6.5 lakhs for the Asiatic Society. It was a passion and commitment that was dear to her heart. An endowment lecture in her name has been held every year from the year 2007, and the lecture has to be subsequently published in the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai. The first lecture was delivered by Dr. D.R. Sardesai, Emeritus Professor of History, University of California in Los Angeles, on the contribution of Bombay Parsis to the nationalist movement. Zareer, are you listening? And then Mr. Sorabji, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India, inaugurated the lecture series where he was president of the session. The list of publications of books and articles is very long, so I will not read it out, but there are really very many, and the first one was From the Iranian Plateau to the Shores of Gujarat, which was published in 2002. Before I introduce Dr. Zareer Masani and Dr. David, I think the Asiatic Society would like to honor them with a gift of books. Mr. Kare, would you please do the honors? So to introduce the speaker of the day, Dr. Zareer Masani, he is the author of Macaulay, Britain's Liberal Imperialist, published in 2014. He is a doctorate in history from the University of Oxford and is the author of 3 other historical books: Indira Gandhi, a biography published in 1975, Indian Tales of the Raj, 1987, and India from Raj to Rajiv, 1988. He has also written a widely acclaimed family memoir titled And All Is Said, Memoir of a Home Divided, published in 2013. Zareer spent 2 decades as a current affairs producer for the BBC and is now a freelance historian, journalist, and broadcaster. Last year, he presented, it was last year, if I'm not mistaken, 2 documentaries on India for BBC Radio 4, one on the Tata business empire, and the other on religious censorship and threats to freedom of expression in the Indian media and arts. He is currently preparing a BBC program about the battle for gay rights in India.
That was a year ago. So
oh, right. Okay, so it's not...
It went out.
Oh, I'm sorry. So that's been already published. Okay.
It went out on BBC Radio 4.
Okay, about a year back, fine. So Zareer's particular areas of interest are the legacies of the Raj in India today. He has written about the role of India in World War II and the Bengal famine of 1943, and is currently working on a major new biography of India's first Governor General, Warren Hastings, whose brilliant career ended with his impeachment by Edmund Burke. So that's Dr. Masani for you. And if I may introduce our chairperson, Professor Dr. M.D. David. He was here just a month ago when he launched his latest book, Torchbearers of the Deccan Blazing Up the Northern Skies. This was published in January 2018. So I won't give you a very long introduction on Dr. David because, again, the CV is extremely long. And I think most people here already know him and know about him. So for those who don't, Dr. David has been an outstanding teacher of history at college and university levels and has been serving the cause of education and history for over 40 years. He retired as professor and head Department of History, University of Mumbai. He has continued to serve the cause of education as the founder, chairman of Mumbai History Teachers Academy. He runs on behalf of the trust 3 reputed ICSE schools, one in Mumbai and another in Panchgani, that belong to the CMEF Trust. He is the founder of Good Shepherd School at Manmad, again ICSE proposed. In order to make available a high standard of education and educational facilities available to urban students and to the students in semi-urban towns. Now, Dr. David has more than 28 books to his credit, and I think the last one is the 29th, the title that I just mentioned to you, and a great number of research articles and papers. I think there are more than 65 research articles that he has published at national and that were delivered at national and international conferences. He has held many academic and other positions. I'll just mention a couple of them. He was a member of Research and Recognition Committee in History of the University of Mumbai, and he was a member of the Executive Committee of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai Town Hall and convener of the Public Lectures Committee. Thank you, Dr. David, for being with us today. May I now invite Dr. Masani.
Right. Aminal, thank you so much for the introduction, which was very interesting. I'm sorry, I was checking something in between, but I caught 90% of what you were saying. And the whole sort of story of Mani Kamerkar, which is new to me, I didn't know about her. I assume she would have known my father well, because they were both in the Socialist Party, in the Congress Socialist Party in the 1930s.
And that is why it was very appropriate that you should give this.
How kind of you to remind me of that. No, I'm sure that connection was there. Now, I'm firstly very happy to be talking in these hallowed precincts, which I think fit the subject I'm going to be talking about, which is the rediscovery of India's classical heritage by British Orientalists, mainly based in organizations like the Asiatic Society of Calcutta, I have to say, which was the starting point. The Asiatic Society of Bombay, as you would know, came much later, started as the Bombay Literary Society, and then got renamed sometime in the mid-19th century, I think, as the Asiatic Society. But the premise of my talk today is going to be challenging the notion that the British were just out to subjugate India and were only studying its culture for the purpose of somehow appropriating it in order to colonize Indian minds and better manage India, which is, I'm afraid, the notion that has been propagated by Edward Said and his disciples, the whole idea that Orientalism was a form of colonial appropriation, and that this awful expression they invented, the colonial gaze, was about annexation. Now, I'm starting off with a couple of slides here which show you the colonial gaze before the Raj was established. This is a painting in the 1780s by William Hodge of a Hindu temple. And the next one is Akbar's tomb at Sikandra, painted by Thomas Daniel, the great 18th century painter. And what these paintings show is, and there are hundreds and thousands of them actually, is the tremendous curiosity and fascination with India from artists who had no particular investment in the imperial project and were simply trying to, present what to them were very exotic, that's much better, and romantic and sort of very intriguing things. So I think what the attack on Orientalism misses completely is the fact that there's such a thing as cultural curiosity. The desire to know, to be curious about other cultures, comes from very different motivations from simply wanting to annex and appropriate. So having said that, I'm going to talk about the role of some very prominent British Orientalists in the rediscovery of India's cultural heritage in a way that would have been impossible without their intervention. Because what had happened for a millennium after the Islamic conquest was a huge hiatus with India's classical Hindu and Buddhist pasts. And it wasn't just the Muslims who were responsible for it. The Hindus totally eradicated the Buddhist past before the Muslims came and eradicated a lot of Hindu temples and centers of learning. So the starting point for recovering all of this was someone called Sir William Jones, who some of you may have heard of. That's a portrait of him. He was brought out to Calcutta as a judge in the newly formed Supreme Court by Governor General Warren Hastings. And he was a great Orientalist, a great philologist, a great student of classics in Greek and Latin, but also in Persian. And he was one of these incredible polymaths whose disciplines sort of ranged across all sorts of subjects. And I mean, the 18th century European Enlightenment produced many such people. So what Jones did was, with the patronage of Warren Hastings, the Governor General, he established the Calcutta Asiatic Society. It was in 1784. And what they did there was to establish, it was a voluntary organization, but it got some government funding. And it became a focal point for a huge army of volunteers who were basically British district officers, judicial officers, police and military officers who were fascinated by India's classical heritage and were recruited as a kind of mass volunteer army of thousands of people who scoured the countryside for antiquities. There was a huge taste in Europe for rediscovering classical antiquities, and this was then brought to India, where there was no interest in classical antiquities. I mean, the whole Indian attitude to antiquity was a very negative one, in some ways still is. The idea that old things are not good things, you need new things. If something is slightly damaged or broken, you throw it out. The idea of restoring, of conserving, was a very foreign Western concept. So coming to Jones, I'm going to move this back a bit. Yes. I think that's okay. Yeah. Sorry, my sight is struggling slightly with the size of my typeface. It's better. Yeah, I want to read you a quote from William Jones. And he said about Sanskrit, he set about learning Sanskrit, and he found it quite difficult to find anyone to teach him, because the local Brahmins in Calcutta were adamant that they would not teach a non-Brahmin Sanskrit, let alone a foreigner. So he eventually persuaded a local doctor who knew Sanskrit to teach him, and he and his wife both studied Sanskrit. And, he was there in India for a decade and thoroughly immersed in all this. And he said, and I quote him, he found Sanskrit more perfect than Greek, more copious than Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either. I am in love with the gopis, charmed with Krishna, and an enthusiastic admirer of Rama. Arjun, Bhim, and the warriors of the Mahabharata appear greater in my eyes than Ajax or Achilles appeared when I first read the Iliad. So this was a very non-patronizing, very genuine love affair with Sanskrit and with the Hindu epics, which he was then able to read, and some of which he had translated. So, in fact, the first translation of the Bhagavad Gita happened under the auspices of the Calcutta Asiatic Society, with support from Warren Hastings. So the Asiatic Society had this network of volunteers. Many of them were their colleagues, some of their colleagues who were less committed to Indian antiquities called them Brahminized, because they spent all their leisure time searching out Hindu temples and relics. Now, I mentioned the Bombay Society having been founded it was in 1804, called the Bombay Literary Society, but I won't go into its history. You probably know more about it than I do. What is important to remember is that there were no Hindu historical texts, because there were hardly any historical texts in the Muslim period, but none surviving from the Hindu period, except for an obscure medieval Kashmiri text called the Rajatarangini. But there was no, whether there were Hindu historical texts that were destroyed and didn't survive, or whether they never went into writing them, there certainly wasn't a fashion for writing history. And so there were no historical texts for these early Orientalists to work with. So very simple things were impossible. It was impossible to date the Buddha. In fact, many people thought that the Buddha was Egyptian or Ethiopian. They didn't know that he was Indian at that time. And this, I'm talking about the early 19th century. Then the Maurya dynasty. Now, it was William Jones who actually dated Chandragupta Maurya by reference to his Greek contemporaries, because he received a Greek ambassador called Megasthenes. So Jones had the dates for Megasthenes, and that gave him the dates for Chandragupta Maurya's reign. Working back from there, he was able to date the Buddha, because from Chandragupta Maurya's reign back, there was a record of the antiquity of the Buddha. But again, the provenance of the Buddha was not agreed. Many people thought he wasn't Indian. Now, so in some ways, these were very exciting times, because there was this sense of adventure, of discovery, of really coming up with things that were very shattering to people's prejudices and preconceptions. And William Jones gave lots of lectures at the Asiatic Society. They published lots of journals on subjects. He spoke on subjects ranging from Indian classical music to wildlife, botany, and of course Hinduism and Sanskrit. Now, the second important person in my narrative is, that is a view of the Calcutta Asiatic Society, which is a very, and it's now dwarfed by what's gone on either side of it. This was the other person who came. He was recruited by William Jones, James Princip. And Princip was again a polymath. He was a numismatist, a coin expert by profession, employed in the East India Company's mint. But he was recruited by Jones to run the Asiatic Society, and he became secretary of the Asiatic Society. And Jones was by then getting ready to go back after 10 years in India, so Princip was taking over. But the Asiatic Society was something he did in his spare time. Now, what Princip's time here coincided with was the discovery of some rather interesting inscriptions, which we now know to be the edicts of Ashoka, but at that time no one knew what they were, in what language they were, because they were in a language which was said to resemble pinmen. I'll give you an example of it here. So this is one of the Ashoka pillars with the writing, which was, we now know to be the Brahmi script, in which Sanskrit was once written. But it had no connection, or very little connection, with the Devanagari script. So it was an enormous challenge to actually work out what or not, secondly, what was being said. And the Brahmins had no knowledge of it. The Brahmi script had completely died out, and there was no knowledge of it. So Princip really started from scratch. And it was a very painstaking process, because what they had to do was that there was, initially people speculated about whether this was some strange form of Greek, and whether Alexander's armies had in some way, imported this strange form of Greek to India. They also thought the pillars looked more Greek than Indian. So there was a lot of confusion. The Banaras Brahmins refused to help and laid lots of false trails to kind of put people off the scent. And from Kathmandu in Nepal, the resident of at the court of the Maharaja of Nepal, down to the Deccan, collecting coins, inscriptions, and so on, which could be put together and compared and give a clue to this strange Pinmen language. So the way it was eventually deciphered was that there were three pillars that were found, one from Bihar, one from Delhi, and one from Allahabad. And the inscriptions were carefully compared, which was difficult because they were very rubbed, but they were compared and found to be identical. Then there was the discovery of the word Dhanam, the Sanskrit word Dhanam, which gave the clue to the whole language. So once they discovered Dhanam in this script, which was the clue to the rest of the consonants and vowels, and this led to the decipherment of the Brahmi script. There were also clues at the Buddhist stupa at Sanchi, which were matched with these pillars. Now, Princip was also able then, working backwards from there, to show how the Devanagari script had evolved from the Brahmi script, and how the Sanskrit language had evolved and changed over that period. Now, once Ashoka pillars started surfacing, several appeared. There were 9 in all, and they were found to range from areas as distant as Peshawar in the northwest frontier down to Orissa in the Deccan, showing the reach of the Mauryan Empire. And they included edicts about setting up hospitals for animals and humans, and about Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism. This was actually one of the main messages that was being promoted through the pillars and the edicts. And there was an important, here is one of the lion. There is the famous lion-topped capital, which is now the emblem of the government of India. This was all discovered by British explorers in the early to mid-19th century in Girnar in Gujarat, with this Brahmi inscription on it. Again, hugely important in deciphering the language. And it was a huge feat to actually transcribe it, because in order for Princip to see it in Calcutta, an expedition was sent to transcribe it onto cloth. And each letter of this Pinmen script was about 2 feet big on this rock. So it took months to actually transcribe it and then send it to Calcutta, where Princip was able to translate it. And it was Ashoka's edicts. Not surprisingly, 15 years of this kind of work drove poor Princip literally insane. He had a complete nervous and physical breakdown. He was put on a ship back to England, and he died a few months later. He totally just wore himself out in this battle to discover the Mauryan past. The other big clue, apart from scripts and writing, because there were no historical texts, apart from the Ashoka edicts, which were very important because they were the only surviving texts as such. But what did survive was monuments. So India's history had to be reconstructed from lost pavilions, from buried treasures, and there was a series of monuments which had discovered from the late 18th century onwards, which were quite important as landmarks of both of Indian histories and of different dynasties and how they related to each other, and especially the importance of Buddhism, which, as I say, had been totally eradicated by both the Brahminical takeover and then the Muslim takeover. So now here we have Mahabalipuram, which was discovered in the 1770s. And what was interesting about this, and what it the British picked up on from it was that Indian temple sculpture literally emerged out of rock, because the Mahabalipuram temples were carved out of boulders, and that this idea of the temple as a sculpture emerging out of the rock rather than as an architectural concept being constructed was peculiar to Hindu and Buddhist temple architecture. So Mahabalipuram was an important landmark in that. Then we had, closer to here, we had Elephanta, which again was discovered, one of the earliest finds, which was reported to the Asiatic Society in Calcutta. There wasn't one in Bombay yet. And this was, again, initially used by the Portuguese, who used some of the sculptures for target practice, but later salvaged by the British and conserved. And then we have Kanheri, which was here, which was also, of course, near Bombay. And it was discovered by an artist and Egyptologist who's there called Henry Salt. And he discovered this in 1806, so quite early. And he found that the caves were covered in white stucco. So initially it was, he didn't realize, because they had been used by the Portuguese as a church. So he very painstakingly removed the stucco and uncovered these wonderful sculptures. Now, moving on. Yes, in fact, Salt reported his findings at a meeting of what was then the Bombay Literary Society. It had just been founded. This was 1806 and was the forefather of where we are now. Then followed the discovery of Ajanta and Ellora. And here is one of the most famous frescoes from Ajanta of a bodhisattva. Now, again, this raised interesting questions because, again, the subject matter was Buddhist and was identified as such. So there were links with the other Buddhist stupas, etc., which had been found in other parts of the country. There was much debate first as to whether they were Hindu or Buddhist, and eventually it was decided they were Buddhist. Secondly, there was a lot of puzzlement about why they were abandoned in such remote places. Why had people put these in caves in sort of a wilderness? And then there was a theory that, again, that these were so sophisticated and so, equal to anything that Western classical culture had produced, that they must have been the work of foreign artisans, probably Greeks whom Alexander had left behind, or who had been imported by Indian rulers. So the idea that they were indigenous to India took quite some time to be vindicated. So we have the Ajanta fresco. I mean, the story of Ajanta is interesting because it was just a British cavalry officer who was spending his spending his leave on a hunting expedition in the wilds of Berar. And he stumbled on a story about these caves, and he said he must explore them. They were mainly inhabited by tigers. In fact, that whole area had a large tiger population at the time, and by bhils, who were almost as ferocious as the tigers. So he had to brave the bhils and the tigers to get inside the caves to take a look at these frescoes, and he was absolutely blown away by them. And he reported back to the Asiatic Society here in 1836. No, I'm sorry, again, it was the Calcutta Asiatic Society in 1836, to which he reported the wonders of Ajanta's frescoes, which also were very interesting because they dated from the 1st century BC to the 7th century AD. So it showed a huge continuity, 8 centuries of civilization and how it had evolved. What they did find was that the frescoes were deteriorating, had been deteriorating, were continuing to deteriorate. So something needed to be done. So they decided that the first step was to copy them before they vanished even further. So Major Robert Gill, and it's interesting how many of these people were military officers, arrived at Ajanta, spent the next 27 years copying this and other paintings, many of which have since disappeared from the original caves. And as tragically, Gill's entire collection of reproductions went to London to be displayed at the Crystal Palace exhibition, and it was destroyed in the fire of 1866, which destroyed the Crystal Palace. So Gill, who was really one of the unsung heroes of this story, returned to Ajanta, started all over again, but he died a year later. Now, I think I've got, yes, this is a painting of him painting, and unfortunately there isn't much, I haven't been able to find any portraits of him. But I think he really deserves to be celebrated because he spent the better part of his life painting this wonderful heritage. Then his work, after he died, his work was continued for the next 13 years by someone called John Griffiths of the JJ School of Art. And again, the results were displayed in London, this time at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And again, they were destroyed by fire. So Ajanta seems to have had this curse to it. Luckily, Griffiths' work had been photographed before the fire, so the photographs were published in 1897. There were conservation attempts at Ajanta, and there was a well-intentioned attempt to cover them with varnish, which actually then was shown to be accelerating the erosion, so they stopped doing that. And then they brought in 1920, they brought in two skilled Italian fresco painters who came, and they had experience of conserving Italian frescoes, and they did the job that actually has pretty much lasted till the present time. Ajanta went viral in London when the photographs were published. There were features in the Burlington magazine, in the Illustrated London News, and we even had the famous dancer Anna Pavlova doing a performance at Covent Garden, which was meant to be in the style of Ajanta. It's very sort of much a kind of Western fancy dress idea of what classical Indians, what form the dance took, but you can judge for yourself. It's rather exoticized. But it was all the rage in London, Ajanta and its frescoes. So the other monument which played a major role in identifying the Buddhist past was the Great Stupa at Sanchi, which again was discovered by a British military officer, Captain Fell, in 1819. And we have the Sanchi Stupa there. Is that? Sorry. Yes. The Captain Fell was very bemused by the dome-like shapes of stupas like that, and he wrote in the Calcutta Journal that he felt unable to give even a very faint idea of the magnificence of such stupendous structures and exquisitely finished sculpture. This is a detail of one of the gates. It's the famous Yakshi, who is incredibly voluptuous. It was very much a kind of the ideal of Indian female beauty in Mauryan times, and we're going back to the 2nd century BC. And these wonderful elephants. And I mean, what both the Yakshi and the elephants demonstrate is that Indian art, as was later pointed out by other experts, was much more conceptual than representational. So the reality was, you saw the quality of femininity in that figure rather than the anatomical accuracy of Western Renaissance painting, which was painting every bone and muscle. This was a very different aesthetic, which was conceptual. Similarly with the elephants, they convey elephantine qualities without the detail of elephants that you would get in a contemporary Western painting. So this idea of the conceptuality of Indian art, I think, is very well illustrated by that. Now, yes, I was talking earlier about the origins of the Buddha and the controversies about this. Now, initially, as I said, people thought he was Egyptian or Ethiopian. Then a British naturalist and surveyor went to Burma to study Buddhism, and he found oral evidence there that the Buddha had come to Burma from Bihar. So this gentleman then explored Bihar a decade later, and he discovered Bodh Gaya and the ruins there, and he declared them to be definitively Buddhist. However, the former Buddhist temple at Bodh Gaya was being used by Hindu Brahmins. Buddhism had long died out there, and it was being used as a Hindu temple. But the Brahmins told him stories about strange pilgrims coming from faraway places to worship another deity called the Buddha. And it turned out that these were Burmese visitors who had been coming. They also found various Nepalese and Tibetan texts which confirmed the provenance of the Buddha, and there were travelogues by Chinese monks who had come in the 5th century AD to India, traveled around, this was during the Gupta period, and seen a lot of evidence which was still there of Buddhism. So now I'm going to come on to another major figure in the rediscovery of India, who was a lieutenant, who started his life as a lieutenant, Alexander Cunningham. He retired as a general. He came from a modest Scottish family, as a lot of Orientalists did. He arrived in India in 1833 as a lieutenant in the Royal Engineers. Then he became ADC to Governor General Auckland, and he served in various military campaigns, including the Sikh Wars. This is a picture of him with a team of fellow explorers. So what he did on his military travels was, wherever he went, and he went to remote places like Kashmir and Ladakh, antiques and to research antiquities. And this is him with one of his teams. The 1830s were a particularly crucial time. I've already mentioned some of the discoveries then with the script, etc., and the Ajanta discoveries. And Cunningham actually led this process. He was the most widely traveled of all his contemporaries across India, and is generally considered the father of Indian archaeology.